This is a presentation on exchange rates and more specifically floating exchange rate regimes. So exchange rates is the value of one currency expressed in terms of another. So US dollars and euros, for example, if the exchange rate is 0.80, then that's saying that for every US dollar you would only get 0.80 euro. And again, we're going to look at floating exchange rate now, which is when we have an exchange rate that is determined purely by the free market. The government does not interfere, and that can result in an appreciation of a currency. That's when the value of a currency increases in respect to another currency, or a depreciation, which is when the value of a currency goes down compared to another currency. So the diagram, we start with a simple microeconomic diagram. I label my axes price and quantity. I label my curve supply and demand, but then I start with this diagram and then I'm going to add a little more. Price becomes price of 1x dollars in y dollars. Supply becomes the supply of x dollars from country X. Country X is where the x dollar is used. That's where the supply comes from there. Demand becomes demand for x dollars from country Y. If we're looking at an exchange rate of x in terms of y, then we're interested in how much people in country Y want x dollars. And finally, quantity simply becomes quantity of x dollars. After all, whenever we do a microeconomics diagram, it is price and quantity and supply and demand of a particular item. In this case, that particular item is the x dollar. So to make this a little clearer, let's actually plug in some real currency. So let's look at the y-axis label first. It's going to go from price of 1x dollar in y dollar to price of 1 US dollars in euros. Let's look at supply. Supply is going to go from supply of x dollars from country X to supply of US dollars from the United States. US dollars come from the United States. Demand is going to go from demand for x dollars from country Y. Now we're going to plug it in as demand for US dollars from the European Union. And then finally, quantity of x dollars will be quantity of US dollars. And so you actually can see that we have price of US dollar, supply of US dollar, demand of US dollar, and quantity of US dollar. So this is just the market for the US dollar in terms of the euro. So we have to add European Union in here, and we have to throw the euro over here to know the reference currency. So what changes a floating exchange rate? What are the determinants? We really need to focus on two things. Which citizens or firms are changing their habits? If it's citizens and firms in country X, then that's going to affect the supply of the x dollars from country X. And if it's citizens and firms in the other country, in country Y, when we're talking about the x dollar, then it's going to be demand for x dollars that will shift. So just to clarify that, if citizens and firms in the United States are changing their habits, then that's going to affect the supply of US dollars on the foreign exchange market. But if citizens or firms in, say, the European Union are changing their habits, that's going to change the demand for US dollars on the foreign exchange market. Once we determine if we're going to shift the supply curve or the demand curve, then we have to say, well, was there an increase and decrease in economic activity? If the change results in an increase in economic activity, then the curve will shift to the right. And if there's a decrease, then the curve will shift to the left. This is better explained with examples, which we'll do next. But a lot of times with exchange rates, just like so many economic concepts, you can kind of use some common sense to figure it out. For example, if Americans want more European products, then they're also going to start spending more of their dollars. They're going to put more of their dollars out on the market. That's going to shift supply of US dollars from the United States to the right. And that, if you shift the supply curve right, you're going to see that the price will drop, right? There'll be a depreciation. Well, common sense would have told you that if Americans start to spend more money overseas, more dollars will be out there, and that will naturally drop the value of the dollar. So that actually was a fairly complex example, but it illustrates the point that just by thinking logically, you probably can determine what's going to happen to the currency. You'll still have to express it diagrammatically. So let's look at how we can do that. Before we do, let's focus a little more in what it is that will shift those curves. Maybe there's going to be a change in demand for products, and that could be a result of a change in income, a change in the taste or popularity of products from a particular nation, or maybe a change in the rate of inflation. If inflation is occurring quicker in one country than another, then it will seem like those goods are becoming more expensive. So people might not want those goods, as an example. A change in investment prospects. If it looks favorable to invest in a country, you're going to want that currency. So that will drive up demand for the currency. If people from the United States want to invest in other countries, then the supply of US dollars will go up because they're putting more of their money out there. Interest rates for savings. So if you see a foreign country is offering good interest rates, if you save money there, you might be inclined to save money there. In order to do that, you need to put your US dollar out on the market to convert it to a different dollar so you can invest that dollar in that bank. So if Americans, for example, see good interest rates on Swiss banks, they're going to have to take their US dollars and convert that into Swiss francs. And in doing that, they're going to put more US dollars on the foreign exchange market, driving the value down. And finally, speculators. And the last example we'll have today is on speculators. What they think is going to happen to the currency will have an effect on the demand and the supply of the currency, because they buy and sell currency based on what they expect to happen next. So let's start with this basic example. The average income of US citizens increases. If this were to happen, then what do we expect? Well, first we have to identify, is the change in habit happening, we're talking about the US dollar now, is it happening domestically where the US dollar is used in the US, or is it happening abroad? And if the average income of US citizens is increasing, then we can say that the change is happening domestically. It's happening in the same place where the US dollar is used. So we know that's going to affect the supply of the US dollar. And if average income goes up, then we expect Americans to increase their economic activity. So we have to shift the supply curve because we're talking about US citizens and US dollars, and we see that they're increasing their habit. So that's going to lead to a shift to the right. So sure enough, when we shift supply to the right, we can just call it S1. We don't have to relabel it. We see that there's a new price, a new equilibrium, that creates a P1 that is lower than P, and we see depreciation occurred. And so, again, stepping away from the diagram, if Americans had more money, they would start to spend some of it overseas more and more. More and more US dollars would become available around the world, or in this case, just between the US and the European Union. And if more US dollars are out there, then they start to lose their value, and so there's depreciation. And when you diagram it, make sure you use the term depreciation and you refer to P going down to P1. Let's look at another example. This one says Europeans find US products to be undesirable. So we determine, okay, we're talking about the US dollar. Which group is changing their activity? Is it Americans or is it Europeans? In this case, it's Europeans. So that's going to affect the demand for the US dollar from the European Union, because it's the Europeans changing their habits. And are they going to increase or decrease their economic activity? Well, if they're finding US products undesirable, they're going to decrease their economic activity. So we shift demand to the left, and that's what it looks like here. And so as Europeans are no longer demanding US currency, that's going to create a new equilibrium, and prices are going to drop. There's the depreciation along the y-axis once again. And so, again, stepping away from the diagram, if Europeans are demanding less US products, they're also going to want US dollars less. If they want US dollars less, and there's less of a call for US dollars, then the value of the US dollar goes down. So that's what we're showing on the diagram. So again, depreciation, P to P1 shows that. This example says interest rates in the United States increase. So if interest rates in the US increase, then that means that if you invest in an American bank, you can actually make maybe higher interest rates than you previously could have. So Europeans might be very interested in this case in saving in US banks. So we're going to look at, again, demand for US dollars from the European Union, because we're talking about Europeans changing their habits in order to take advantage of something that's happening in the United States. And if the interest rates in the US dollars increase, interest rates in US banks increase, then the Europeans are going to say, I want to invest in US banks, but first I need US dollars. So their demand for US dollars will increase. And that's what we're showing here. Demand for US dollars increasing. And what happens? P goes to P1. We see an appreciation this time. And so if you answer the question, you write out because interest rates in the US dollars increase, Europeans want more US dollars so they can invest in American banks. And that results in an increase in demand for US dollars, parentheses, D to D1, close parentheses, which leads to an appreciation, and then parentheses, P to P1, close parentheses. One last example, and speculators are interesting. Let's say American speculators believe that the euro will lose value next year. So if we're talking about the US dollar, then we're also saying that, all right, the US dollar is used in America. In this example, it's Americans who are changing their habits. So now we're going to look at the supply of the US dollar again. And if American speculators believe that euro will lose value next year for whatever reason, they're not going to want euros anymore. So they're going to stop converting their US dollars into euros. And when they stop converting their US dollars into euros, then the supply of US dollars coming from the US will reduce. And so I show that here. And what happens to the US dollar? The US dollar appreciates against the euro in this case. So in this example, again, American speculators want to stop buying the euro because they believe it's going to lose value. The supply of the US dollar on the foreign exchange market therefore decreases because speculators are no longer buying euros, and that we show that by S shifting to S1, a decrease in the supply of US dollars, and price going up, but we don't call it price, we call it the exchange rate, and when it goes up we use the term appreciation. Now what's interesting is as the US dollar appreciates, let's look at the euro. So I just changed my labels. Now I'm looking at the exchange rate of the euro compared to the dollar. And so complete switch in your mind now. American speculators believe the euro will lose value next year. Well, now we're talking about American demand for the euro. So now let's look at the demand curve. And if American speculators believe that the euro will lose value next year, they're going to demand less of the euro because they think it's going to lose value. What happens to the euro? It depreciates because demand will shift to the left. So again, what happens to the US dollar in this same exact example? The US dollar appreciates, P to P1, but if we look at the euro depreciates, going from P to P1. That's important when we're talking about two currencies and exchange rates. As one appreciates against the other, then the other is depreciating against the original one, and that's what we're showing here. So ignore the example just one more time. Here's an example of the euro depreciating against the dollar because of a low demand for the euro or a decrease in demand for the euro. And at the same time that is occurring, there's an appreciation of the US dollar because going back again, as the demand for the euro decreases, that also means Americans are buying less euros, and so the supply of US dollars coming from the United States is also decreasing. And so we can see the US dollar appreciating while the euro is depreciating. That's a wrap-up of exchange rates and floating exchange rates in particular. So reflecting on this, keep in mind that exchange rates aren't that complicated. Use your common sense. You can usually figure out if an exchange rate will depreciate or appreciate just by thinking about how the change in the market would influence a product as if it were any product, forgetting that it was a currency. And also remember how those diagrams are built, how we start with a simple microdiagram and then we plug in the currency that we're focusing on. And finally, remember that those diagrams were actually diagramming the demand and supply of a currency, not of any particular goods, but what is the value of a currency based on the demand and supply of that currency in terms of another.